Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Alexander, and welcome to this session on how Microsoft is open sourcing the Business Central application on GitHub. As I said, I'm Alexander. I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. With me today is Jonas.
Yeah, so my name is Jonas. I'm the engineering manager for the engineering systems team with the platform team of Business Central. So we deal with all sorts of things relating to builds and GitHub and pull requests, test execution, development environments, like all these kinds of things, and this kind of stuff we'll be talking about today.
And my name is Freddy Kristiansen. I'm a technical evangelist with Microsoft, sitting actually close to these guys in the building and working together with both Alexander and Jonas today on ALGO for GitHub, also responsible for Docker, Container Helper, and other kinds of things that lies between what we're using in Microsoft and what you guys are using in your area. So, let's talk about what we will be covering in this session and what we won't be covering. We're going to talk about migrating to ALGO for GitHub, but not how you guys are going to migrate to ALGO for GitHub. We're going to talk about why and how we are doing that. So, it's a session about basically what these guys have run into of challenges by taking us and saying we want to do open source development, co-development with you guys on Business Central. We're also going to cover how we ship fixes and features to the online tenants and how we secure the supply chain. Discuss release management and how open sourcing is going to change that. What goes into our releases? What is, like, when we talk about the next version of this, then we have a number of different things that will add ideas and will add work items to our schedule. And how will this work with open sourcing? And can you guys just ship something together with us without putting it ever into our plans? And how is that going to work? And then the what's next item, what's next for open sourcing, and what's next for ALGO for GitHub. And then we'll see, I think we'll leave some room for questions after that. But first of all, a disclaimer. As I said, this is not a session that talks about how everybody is going to move to GitHub. In fact, it is not a goal for Microsoft, and it's not a goal for me that everybody will move their stuff to ALGO for GitHub. Recently, we put this survey out on LinkedIn and Twitter, or X, as it's called now, to get some answers on where the current landscape is for people using DevOps. I got a lot of questions. Oh, this is people are reading between the lines, thinking that this is an attempt to find the people who are not on GitHub and make them move to GitHub. It's not. But it is an attempt to see how many people are in the none bucket up there. It's like 14% of all partners participating in this survey do not have any kind of DevOps today. And I think that's a problem. I don't think it's a problem that we have around 49% on ALGO, ALOps, and Alpaca. I think those are fine. They are managed solutions. There's somebody taking care of maybe not the pipelines, but definitely the tools and the tools that you're using. So whenever there's changes to PowerShell, like Docker, Windows, SQL Server, stuff like that, somebody is managing that. It can be quite a big task to maintain all of these things if you are doing things yourself. And the very tall here, the self-made, are probably people that have participated in a CI/CD hands-on lab at some point in time and decided we can do that ourselves, which was fine. Today, I think people are spending a lot of time on that. And we would like them to consider whether the best choice would be to move to a managed solution. At least calculate how many hours are you spending on staying on something you're building yourself. versus how much time you would save, maybe your resources could be spent on something that actually provides customer value instead of working on internal system that could be done much easier. I'm totally aware that some partners have like a setup that vastly exceeds the capabilities of ALGO, or maybe even ALOps or Alpaca, that will need to do things themselves. Like we're doing a lot of things on top of ALGO as well in Microsoft. But I think it is worth mentioning that people in the self-made bucket will have even more work in the future. Stuff is happening, right? Page scripting, code coverage, other things. All the things that we will be providing for these tools, people that made them themselves will have to like do stuff to every single of their repositories in order to uptake those changes, right? So, why are we migrating to GitHub? Why are we open sourcing? Business Central is something we'll cover later. Why are we open sourcing Business Central on GitHub? Is something we'll cover here. GitHub is the largest open source community in the world. Million of developers, and probably every single person in here has a GitHub account as well. So people will have the ability to contribute or co-develop with us very easily on GitHub. That's one reason. The next reason, which could stand alone, all Microsoft open source projects must be on GitHub. Okay, we couldn't get around that one. So when we are open sourcing stuff on GitHub, well, we have to follow a license. We have to use a specific license for that open source project. There's a code of conduct that people have to sign a CLA with Microsoft whenever they contribute with a piece of software. The system will take care of a lot of stuff for us, and we're forced to follow all the best practices that Microsoft puts upon us. So we cannot have like secrets in our source code, and there's a lot of things that will be flagged by our internal systems if we don't take care of that. We want to leverage all the innovations that are on GitHub. There's tons of new functionality coming. Like every single month, there'll be, a lot of functionality coming constantly. We'll talk more about that in a second. And we want to use the same workflows as our partners. By creating a tool like ALGO for GitHub and providing that for our partners to use, we'll be using the same tool as our partners are when running on that, meaning that when we are going to like add stuff like code coverage or page scripting functionality to ALGO, then partners will be able to use that the same day as we start using that. And last but not least, we can help train Copilot on AL. The more source code that's out there in open source, the better the chance that Copilot has to actually learn about AL. So, GitHub Copilot innovations, like if we look at that now, there's a lot of things coming. I think, I don't know which of those are for the enterprise or for the business edition and what is free and what's not. A lot of this is available also if you're using VS Code, so you can actually do the GitHub Copilot chat in VS Code, I think. But there's a lot of things coming to GitHub in the GitHub UI to like, if you have a pull request, it's not only the pull request description, it's also discussing this pull request with Copilot and other things that Copilot will constantly add to the GitHub experience. And all of those things we kind of get for free, right? Other GitHub innovations, like, have anybody ever tried the GitHub search? A few. It's like instant search of all the millions of repositories out there, kind of like Google just for code, right? And it also searches in your private repositories, so you can search like your code or global, and it's just amazing how fast that one is in comparison to everything else when you're searching code. Code spaces, something coming for GitHub, and code spaces is really. Today, if we look at GitHub Codespaces, It's the idea of having your development environment inside of GitHub. So you'll be spinning up a Docker container, kind of inside of GitHub, and then we can run the AL language extension in there. Unfortunately, Codespaces today is a Linux container, so we cannot run a Business Central instance inside of that. We can run the SQL instance, we can run a lot of other things in there, but the service tier is not made for Linux yet. So maybe one day that's possible. Today you'd have to use Codespaces with some tweaks to connect to a container outside of Codespaces or to a online sandbox. We'll make this an integrated part of ALGO as well as we go forward. There's a GitHub Enterprise Importer. We actually did not use that when we are importing stuff from Azure DevOps. And there's a lot more, including a certification program on GitHub and stuff like that. There's a lot of things in preview on GitHub. I don't think you can read that, can you? Yeah, probably. There's a Copilot workspaces that I think Satya Nadella actually mentioned at Build Conference, and there's just a lot more coming on this one. So how many people know what ALGO for GitHub is? Well, quite a few. So what we did with ALGO for GitHub is to create all the things that, not all the things, I think we normally mention that we want to provide 100% of the functionality needed by 90% of the partners. Doesn't mean that everybody needs to go there, but that's just a possibility, right? So we add branching strategies, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous delivery, and a lot of other things as a plug-and-play solution. So a managed solution that people can use. And on top of that, we add all the GitHub functionalities. So with that, you'll have like one solution where you get all the best things from GitHub and all the best things that are Business Central specific in ALGO for GitHub. And then using settings and other customization capabilities of ALGO for GitHub, you'll probably be able to handle the majority of the needs that you have. Now, there are a lot of people on Azure DevOps, and there's a lot of people that swear to stay on Azure DevOps, and we think that's absolutely fine. As you'll be seeing in this presentation, we actually also have a lot of stuff on Azure DevOps still, and we're not planning to move everything to GitHub. We're planning to move the development piece on GitHub because of the open sourcing, but there's a reason why some of the functionality or some of the processes we have are still on Azure DevOps. With that, I'll give the word to you guys.
Okay, so before we dive into how we ended up moving the system application and business foundation into GitHub, I want to give you a little bit of a background, a little bit of a context. So we started our move to Azure DevOps, I think back in 2016, so we're relatively new users of Azure DevOps. Before that, we were using completely internal systems in Microsoft. We were on a source control system called Source Depot, which is a system, anybody know about Perforce, this old source control version system? Some of you, yeah, so basically Microsoft bought the source code to that like 20 years ago and rewrote parts of it and created a new source control system that all of the different teams within Microsoft were running on. And then in terms of build systems and stuff, we're also using stuff that came out of the Windows org. Something that called Snap, which meant shiny new automation process. Not entirely sure how shiny it was, but back in 2016, we started to move our things over to Azure DevOps. And back in those days, we were a monorepo. We had everything for Business Central in one single repository. Since then, we made quite a bit of changes. So today, we have about 90 active code repositories in Azure DevOps. Only one of them contains the actual application source code, but there are surrounding repositories that contain functionality around runtime, the compilers, engineering systems, control plane, data plane services, code we share between different repositories and libraries and stuff. We have on average 100 pull requests created every day and modify about 500 files on a daily basis. We run approximately 700 builds per day. And when I talk about builds, I talk about builds in like generic terms, not only building the stuff, but it's a lot more running test cases and compiling databases and building installers and like all these things. And on average, we run about 30 million test cases every day in our Azure DevOps organization, and do 70 full test deployments to the cloud on a daily basis. So every day we deploy the full Business Central solution to the cloud and run login tests, et cetera, to see that whatever changes going into different branches is still capable of running and can be used by our team to test things. We have about 230 terabytes of data in our NuGet feeds and 220-something terabytes in our artifact storage, which is build outputs. So this is just to give you a little bit of a context of the size of the organizations we have inside of Azure DevOps. And the part we're looking at to move into GitHub is the application part. So a bit more context on the application. So we have about 25 new pull requests on a daily basis in the application repository. So that's code that eventually you guys would be seeing. And I don't know if you attended the previous session on doing code reviews, but one of the suggestions was to keep your pull requests small. And I checked our statistics. On average, we have 13 files changed on each pull request. So if you think about a repository that has million lines of code, has hundreds and hundreds of files that change on a daily basis, how do you move that into GitHub? Well, that is a challenge that we're kind of facing. So what happens if you just kind of take a snapshot of the code and move it out? You lose all of the history. And if you lose all the history, how do you blame code? And how do you figure out who made what changes and why, et cetera? And if you decide to move the history, which we did not do with the system application, how do you filter out bad commits that wasn't intended for the public to see? Like perhaps some of these commits contain some credentials or something that shouldn't go into the repo in the first place. How do you make sure you don't have any of those things in the code you're moving out to GitHub? That's a little bit of a challenge for us to figure those things out. On average, we do about 100 buddy build jobs per day. I don't know if buddy build jobs is something. Can I see a hands up? Anybody heard about buddy builds? Nobody? Well, I'm not surprised. It's something we invented. So a buddy build job is something, as a developer, when you're working on your private branch on your changes, you can take your branch and you can send it off to the build system. You can tell the build system, hey, please go and verify that the W1 version of builds and all the tests on W1 passes. Or you can say, hey, test everything. Just test all the countries, all the localizations. Or you can say something like, hey, I want to run this test case 100 times in parallel across 100 machines to make sure that it's stable enough to run. So it's essentially a system for providing a scaled out build capability for our different engineers. And we produce roughly 35 official builds per day out of the application repository. An official build is a special thing in our world because it's a build that is fully signed, fully tested, scanned for all type of threats and issues, and it's something you can potentially ship. Okay, so I have a question for you guys, and I'm not expecting anybody to actually know the answer to this one, but if anybody's getting anywhere close, they'll get a T-shirt. So what do you think this number represents? And Freddy, you can't really respond. The number is 165. Anybody who wants a T-shirt? Tickets? Actually, not what I'm thinking about, but perhaps that's not too far away. Pardon? Issues? Well, no, probably are more than that. But it's a good attempt. You get a T-shirt anyway. Thank you. So 165 represents the amount of compute hours we need to produce a single build. So that essentially means if you want to verify a build locally on your development environment, you're going to spend 7 days waiting for that prompt to return. I don't think a lot of people would like to do that. Another question, how many minutes do you think it takes us to actually run one of these official builds? We're talking about wall time. Like, if you schedule it at noon, when does it come back? If it takes 165 compute hours to run. How many minutes? You get a t-shirt if you get any workflows. Did somebody say 8? I wish. If we can make it happen in 8 minutes, our engineering teams would come and bring us presents on a daily basis. 30, oh, we're not even close. You need to go up. Pardon? Relatively close. It's 140 minutes. So it's still a lot of time for engineers to wait to get these things. Where was the person who? Just come down and pick it up later. Okay, so and the amount of tests we run on each official build is 440,000 test cases, which is obviously why it takes us about 60-something compute hours to get a build completed. And this includes running tests across all of the different localizations, upgrade testing, checking for baseline issues, compatibility issues, all sorts of things. And our build graph is about 800 nodes. So if you compare this to GitHub, every time you see one of these checks, these different steps you have in a GitHub PR, I think we have about 30 of them in BC apps today. Those would be 800 if we were to move the current build system graph nodes we have in our internal system. Okay, so that's a little bit of context. So Alex is now going to talk a little bit about how we moved the system application.
Yes, thank you, Jonas. So hopefully, as you can see, it's quite a challenge to move these types of things to GitHub, and it takes a lot of work. But we've had a head start. I mean, we've started a long time ago, 2016, 2017. I wasn't around at that time, but it's been a while, and we have quite a few repositories out there already. I tried to create like an overview a little bit, but I probably missed some. But as you can see, we have the Business Central application split into 3 repositories, and together it actually consists pretty much of the whole W1 Business Central application that we ship in Microsoft. So base app, add-ons, system application, etc. We have repositories out there for DevOps. Freddy has already talked about ALGO as one of them. Container Helper, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that one as well. ARM templates, etc. We have sample repositories, BC Tech, probably the most notable. You can see various AL snippets and scenarios that you can test out yourself. And of course, documentation as well. But in this presentation here, we'll mainly focus about how we open source the Business Central application. So we'll focus on the first column here, and we'll talk a bit about how we did that using ALGO. So starting with AL app extensions, I believe that was our first Business Central application open source repository going back to 2018. It's had a couple different apps on there, but nowadays it contains the add-ons, so your Shopify apps, sustainability app, etc. Then a little bit later, a couple of years ago, we introduced the Business Central apps repository, which contains the W1 base app. Now, I mean, I count this one as open source. I guess it's actually not open source because it's a private repository, but I think anyone in this room we can give access to. We have a form that you just need to submit, and then we'll give you access. But we've kept it as a private pilot because we're playing a little bit around with how we can open source the base application because it's quite a big app. We'll talk more about the system application, and how we've open sourced that. But the system application is 1 or 2% the size of the base app. So it's a lot of work. There are a lot of questions that we still need to answer, but we have a private pilot out there where if you are interested in making a contribution to the base app or fixing a small bug or something, that's actually possible today. So a little bit extending on what Jonas said, we came from this internal repository that really had all of our AL code in just this one repository. So that means millions of lines of code, thousands of tests. It's a big repository. And to kind of deal with that scale, we had to build up our own custom build system built in this shiny new
automation process.
Yes, exactly. So we have our own internal build system that integrates towards Azure DevOps. That can do building and testing, incremental builds, code signing, help us release and hotfix, and do test deployments. And we've built that up over many, many years. So it's quite a big challenge to kind of just take that and either integrate it towards GitHub or build up something completely new on GitHub. And so for our first attempt at going open source with the AL Lab Extensions repository and the Business Central Apps repository, we actually didn't do that. Our approach there was to basically just take a copy of what we have in our internal repository and put it out there for you guys to see and to make contributions towards and file an issue or whatever it is you can do. So every now and again, we just take a copy, a snapshot of what we have at that point in time. Then you can see what it is. If you want to make a contribution, copy it on back. So obviously, I mean, it's enabled us to go open source relatively simply. I mean, not truly open source, but we can put the code out there, you can see it, and contribute towards it. And we have taken a lot of contributions this way. As I said, AL Lab Extensions and Business Central Apps, they're still live and you can make contributions today. But of course, I mean, it has a lot of downsides as well, right? Like there's all the manual labor with syncing back and forth. Of course, we have scripts to help us do it, but it's still something we have to do on an ad hoc basis. But probably most importantly is this is not really open source. I mean, you guys don't get to see what we're building because we're building in our internal repository. And we want you to see what we're building, and we want you to comment on it if you have any suggestions on what we can do better. As I said, not in the spirit of open source. That's why we introduced BC Apps. BC Apps went live in 2023 directions. Nowadays, it contains the system application and the business foundation. And as I said, the objective here is really to have a truly open source experience where we can code develop the Business Central application with you guys. You can comment on our PR, so you can tell us, why did you do this, or why did you do that? You're more than welcome to. And you can also make your own contributions if you want, from like a whole new feature to also just small bug fixes or whatever it is. So I'll talk a little bit how we did that. And going back to this picture with our internal repository, we had the add-ons-based application and the system application all in this mono repository. And what we did about a year ago is we moved the system application into the BC Apps repository and out of the internal repository. We made up the business foundation that came up since then. And then we've added the BC Apps repository as a submodule in our internal repository. How many are familiar with Git submodules or using GitHub's Git submodules? Yeah, some few. So basically, it's a repository within a repository. And this kind of allowed us to get around a lot of the challenges with, we've built up so much automation around building and testing the system application and all the scale that Jonas talked about, right? It allows us to get around that because now, we can submit all the code on GitHub, but we can still see all the code in our Azure DevOps repository. So if you take a look at what our engineers are seeing, in their VS Code, they used to see a folder with the system application and the business foundation. They still see that. It's just, we've moved some things around a little bit, but it hasn't been ultra breaking for our internal engineers. They can still see all the same code. They can still basically develop in the same way. Use all of our internal scripting for setting up dev environments and requesting test deployments and stuff like that. And so our engineers can see this, but so can our build system. And that means we can actually still, even though we've moved our code to GitHub, we still build and test the system application in the same way in our custom build system that we have internally. And so even though the true source code, the system application that you guys can see in a 24/0 Business Central environment, that code for that lives on GitHub, but we built it in Azure DevOps. So we haven't changed anything there. The way it looks in Azure DevOps is we basically reference, the way Git submodules work is that you reference a commit ID. So at this point in time, we're using this particular commit ID from BC Apps, and then that correlates to a specific commit in the repository. And then we can just update that on a nightly basis, and when it's time for shipping, then we make sure that we've uptaken the latest changes and we've tested and so on. So what you see on BC Apps now is actually what's running in production. So we have the 25.0 and 24.0 and above 23.0 and anything below that is still in Azure DevOps. But going forward, all the new branches and stuff will be added on GitHub. So going back to this picture, this is basically how our world looks now. We've moved out of this mono repo, which has gotten a tiny bit smaller now because we moved the system application. But now that is truly on GitHub and in a truly open source repository for the first time. And that's where ALGO for GitHub comes into play. So even though the system application that we ship is built in our custom build system, we still have a need to build and test the system application on GitHub because we need to validate all the pull requests we're getting and so on. And that's where we've chosen to go with ALGO for GitHub. If we compare our needs for the two, in both cases we need the ability to build and test our apps. We need to validate with code cops and breaking changes checks to make sure we're not breaking any of your code. And we need to do incremental builds on pull requests. As Jonas talked about, we have so many tests, so we need to be able to build incrementally so we don't have to build everything on every pull request. But we've kept all the functionality for code signing and releasing and hotfixing and creating test deployments for our engineers. We've kept that internally, and they can still use the same processes as they did before. So I'll show you a bit how we did that for the BC apps repository using ALGO. How many in here are using ALGO today? A couple. How many have tried it? A couple as well. So ALGO, in ALGO, you basically set up these ALGO projects with settings. And so the way we've set up our build system is basically through a bunch of projects with settings. And I'll give a short little demo of how we did that. So it basically starts up here in the GitHub folder. And we have a global settings file here that applies to all of our different projects on GitHub. So, for example, you can see we build on Windows machines. We're using this particular BC Insider build to publish our apps towards, and so on. So there's a bunch of different settings in here. Our repo version is 25.0 because right now we're building the 25.0 version of the system application in the main branch. And so on. I mean, there are many, many settings here, and I don't want to go through them all. But if we go back into the root folder here, under builds and projects, we've organized all of our ALGO projects in this folder here. So if we take a look, for example, under the system application and settings, you can basically see how we've configured, using ALGO, we've configured our build system really with settings and a couple of override scripts because we have some custom functionality that we want to get out of ALGO, but there's a lot of it that's just configured through settings. So if we go through it, for example, I guess the most important thing here is we need to give the app folder, like where is the system application stored. Then we tell it what build modes to build it in. Build modes might be a little bit a concept we're only using, I'm not sure, but it basically is like different flavors of building a system application. So we always build it just in, let's say, vanilla mode or vanilla flavor. And then, for example, we have translated, which means we build it with translations as well. ALGO also allows for conditional settings. So you can see when we're in a release branch, for example, that means branches we're shipping out of, essentially. We have another mode here called strict mode, which, is a bit stricter. And it's something we enable once we've opened up for signups, for example, for 24.2, I think we shipped last week, so for example. So when we open up for signups there, we enable strict mode to make sure we don't ship some breaking change that's going to break everybody. So there's a bunch of things here. Also just want to point out, do not run tests. We do run tests. We just organized it a little bit differently. So if we go back on your projects, we just have a different ALGO project for the system application tests. And we just give the test folders, and ALGO knows how to run the tests. So those are the ALGO projects, but if we take a look at how that kind of becomes a pipeline, I've taken an example here, where ALGO runs a bunch of different things, but we can, for example, see build system application in translated mode is here, and it runs the build using a combination of ALGO and container helper. And then we have the system application tests are running down here. Takes a bit longer because we have to spin up a container and a BC environment to publish the app stores and run all the tests. But they are indeed running in here in our pipelines, and looks like they're all successful. You can go back here on the summary, and we scroll down to the bottom. We get like a nice overview of all the business foundation tests ran successfully and so on. So that's how we set up ALGO in BC Apps. And of course, all this is open source, so if you're curious about how all this works, you can just take a look. Of course, we also want to validate our code with code cops, and as I mentioned, ALGO is a lot of settings, really. So if we want to enable code cops, just add a setting, enable code cop. As for breaking changes checks, we might have a little bit of a different way maybe of doing that. So we've added a custom override script that is called pre-compile app, and it just runs just before the apps are compiled. We restore the baselines, and then we can run our builds with breaking changes checks enabled, so we don't break things. And finally, incremental builds. That's something we just get for free. I think, internally we had to develop that in our own custom build system, but with ALGO, it's enabled automatically. We get it for free. You can disable it for certain paths if you want a certain path to trigger a full build and so on. So it's also configurable, but it's enabled automatically. So no work for us there, at least not on the BC app side. And of course, these are some of the features we use, but there's lots of additional features that we could start using if we wanted to. Right now we don't have any Power Platform projects in BC apps, but there's Power Platform integration in ALGO. We actually do use the reference documentation with ALDoc. So ALGO has this feature where we can automatically generate reference documentation and publish it to GitHub pages. So it's always updated on every check into the main branch. It automatically updates our documentation. There's a bunch of different features that you basically get for free if you're using ALGO.
Okay, shipping. So I'm going to walk you through the process of how we take these changes in GitHub, system application, business foundation, etc., and how we eventually end up deploying those on the SaaS clusters. It's a pretty straightforward process in most cases, but it's still a little bit of interesting to look at. So of course, everything starts with a pull request in BC Apps repo, and this is the straightforward and simple thing. It's exactly what people expect it to be. You need approval from 2 different reviewers, and you need all of different checks to pass. And these checks can be things like making sure everything builds, the tests are passing, that PowerShell script analyzer is passing, and cred scan runs detecting that there are no credentials in whatever you're pushing or trying to get into a repository. So once this is done, the pull request gets merged into the target branch, and then on a nightly basis, we are moving these changes from GitHub into our internal repository, like Alexander mentioned. And as we do that, also like you mentioned, we rebuild everything, the entire code base from source, and run the full test suites on all of these changes. That means that we verify that the combination of our internal code and what the application code that is out on GitHub will still work together the way we expect it to do. And as part of this, we'll also run a full set of security tools. We'll talk a little bit more about the different security tools we're running later. And when these things are done, we publish a new official build, and as part of that official build, we publish build metadata, and the build metadata contains things like which applications were actually changed in this build. Because once we go to the release processes, we have, I don't know how many hundreds of applications we have, but we can't really ship everything every time. We only ship things that were actually changed. So once we have the build, we initiate some test deployments, making sure that the build can be deployed and the login test is running to make sure you can actually hit that endpoint and that the system is responding as expected. And then we create what is a release pipeline, essentially. And this thing only happens if the associated changes in this latest build has any type of issues that we decide should be fixed. So ICM tickets, live site issues, hotfixes, etc. When developers work on issues, they tag the work item with specific tags if this is something that should be shipped. And if it's an ICM, the system automatically tags it for them. So whenever they're checking code against an ICM ticket, it will automatically trigger a shipping.
One question, Jonas.
Yes.
On the other slide, you said the official build.
Yes.
That is the one we published to Artifact for the partners to use, right?
Correct. Yes. So you guys see this as part of. We publish it also to Artifacts. Okay, so the release process kind of starts with us uploading the impacted applications to FAME, which is this endpoint we have for delivering hotfixes to the SaaS clusters. And after that, the release pipeline is created, and work items like ICM tickets, bugs, etc. We update them. We post a tracking query to those. So engineers or custom support personnel, etc. They can go and look at these pull requests. They can find a work item, and then they can see how far in the rollout process this actually happened. Because as we roll out things, in Microsoft we have this thing called safe deployment practices, which we are required to follow, which in essence boils down to rolling things out slowly with bake time. If we were to roll out a bad fix globally overnight, we'd break everybody. So we start small and we kind of grow over time. We always deploy outside of office hours, at least that's the intention. Customers can configure when they have office hours, and I think they do that in the tenant admin center, and then we use that to determine when we can actually go and hotfix the clusters they're running on. Safe deployment practices have a little bit of different behavior depending on what type of things we're shipping. So if we're shipping new features, which typically would be an upgrade, 24.2, etc., then we upgrade customers progressively over 3 weeks. Like there's a 3-week delay from starting the upgrade process until we're done. And I don't know, do we have anybody from Finland here? Okay, good. Because Finland is the country we start in. So that's a little bit like our canary at the moment. That's where we start, and the reason we start in Finland is because it's also in the same time zone as us, so we can be attentive. If something happens, we can do something about it because we have people working those hours. Hotfixes, though, they typically roll out throughout a week because they are usually issues that needs to be fixed slightly quicker than just 3 weeks. But 1 week is the minimum amount of time we're allowed to roll things out within Microsoft. We can't go any faster unless we get VP approval, which we often don't even try. So our pipelines, they have automated retries. Anytime anything fails to apply hotfixes, upgrades, whatever, we will try again later automatically, so we don't have to monitor those things manually. And we also have a lot of monitors and alerts for engineering team. So if we start seeing a trend in login errors or whatever, we get alerted, and the engineering team and live site team can pause all of the upgrades and rollouts going on at the moment. Okay, that's that about deployments. We are going to move into talking about the supply chain. How many of you have heard about the recent XClib vulnerability that almost hit most major Linux distributions 3 or 4 weeks ago? Yeah, so that's a classic example of a supply chain attack where some maintainers, somebody imposing as being maintainers, managed to sneak vulnerable code into some of the packages that other packages depend upon. And then eventually, if this actually was rolled out live, that had a backdoor into many different popular Linux distributions. So how do we secure the supply chain? Well, there are different kind of layers to this onion. So starting at the simple side of things in GitHub, in terms of code, how do we keep the code secure? Well, in terms of permissions, we make sure that on all of our repositories, we have no persistence administrators. And all of these different processes and entities we have, we always operate with least privilege. And on the source level, whenever you commit or submit code, we always run this cred scan tool, which I think is available for everybody. making sure that none of your commits contains any credentials, passwords, certificates, whatever. We also have something called CodeQL, which is a static code analysis tool, which we run on all of our code internally and also in GitHub. And this is probably the best security tool I've seen so far in the market. We have a fix rate of over 50%. So over 50% of all of the issues found by CodeQL ends up being a real issue, like the way code is passed through the call stack, etc., could lead to a vulnerability. Then we have a tool called Dependabot, which will go and automatically update dependencies when we have vulnerable dependencies out there that needs to be updated. And we require multiple approvers on each of the different pull requests going in. So on Azure DevOps side, though, we add a little bit on things on top of this. Because we had to build, with the scale of the amount of repositories we have and things, we had to build a little bit of additional automation. So the first thing we do is that we deny create branch permissions. So if you're a normal engineer, actually any of us, we can't go and create release branches or anything like that. Because release branches, if anybody can create those, they can also potentially ship. So we make sure that happens through automation only. And given that you have 90 repositories with hundreds of branches and entities and releases and whatever in Azure DevOps, how do you keep track of all of the permissions and all these different entities we have? Well, so we have a baselining system where we generate baseline for all the permissions and store them in a repository and compare it on a daily basis. And if it's modified, we go and create bugs to verify that. If any engineer by mistake should go and create a new branch and assign themselves, contributor rights or admin rights to that branch, will get notified. So, but sometimes you do have to make changes to the systems, and then to be able to get that elevated permissions to be able to do that, we use this Azure PIM, Privileged Identity Management System in Azure. Okay, so the more interesting part, in my opinion, is how do we keep the builds secure? Okay, so I talked about official builds, and official builds, like I mentioned, are builds that we are shipping. So our official builds have branch protection, which means the builds are only allowed to run if they come out of certain branches. So if you have a private branch, if you create a private branch when you're private code, whatever that code may be, you can't run official builds on them. It has to be on official branches like release branches and master, etc. Then we have this component governance system in Azure DevOps that will detect that you're using a vulnerable version of Azure Identity or some component, and it will go and automatically detect and update those versions and get them updated for us. And then we run a set of other tools to make sure that there's nothing bad going on inside of the binaries. Releases. We require approval for every release from an alternative identity. So in Microsoft, we have multiple different identities. We all have CorpNet identities, like the normal email addresses you'll find, like Freddy K at Microsoft. Thank you. For instance. But none of our CorpNet accounts can be used to approve any type of releases. So we have separate accounts and separate computers we use for approving releases. So if our corporate accounts would get compromised, we still can't release anything. And the same thing, branch protection also applies here, so we can only run releases out of predefined branches. No private branches can be used for releasing code. Feed security. So this is an interesting one. So if you think about the issues with this XClib, as well as the SolarWinds that happened a couple of years ago, where people, they change a downstream component and they manage to inject a little bit of bad code into it, and then these things get into the builds, and the system becomes vulnerable. So one way we've kind of dealt with this is that the official builds, they only get to use inputs from a feed that is locked down. So if any other type of build, private branches, etc., needs to produce something for private testing, they need to go into a specific feed and not into the official feed. Because if they were able to ship to the official feed, they would be able to inject something into the builds, and that would be bad. So how do we fix vulnerabilities in BC apps? So the problem here is obviously, if we start fixing code in a public Git repository, then attackers can see what's going on, and they'll be able to figure out that we're working on fixing some vulnerabilities, and they might be able to compromise part of the systems because they know what's vulnerable. So the way this works at our end is that we have a setup where we have a mirror repository of BC apps. So we copy the repository over internally, and we have the full development support in that internal repository. So when we have to, if we have to make security fixes in BC apps, we can do those internally, and we can make sure they are shipped and tested and deployed before we publish them on GitHub, and other people can see what's going on here. Freddy.
With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about release management, even though I'm not the release manager of Business Central, but mostly focused on how open sourcing changes our approach to these things, or will do. If we have a look at a Business Central cycle, it's in 6 months, right? We have a major on April 1st, and we have another major on October 1st. And what are we doing in this time frame? How are we working? And by doing that, I've taken some of this year. So looking at what we shipped on April 1st this year was 24.0. And a lot of things were happening in the branch, in our main branch, where we were working on the version that we were going to ship. But obviously, we don't work until this version, and then okay, now we ship this version, and now we start thinking about what are we going to do for the next version, right? Because then before we would find out, then we would be almost in October again. So stuff happens while we're in the end game of one release, stuff like outlining the goals for the next release, planning, spiking, scoping, figuring out what's smart, what can we do, what not, looking a little closer on these things. What goes into the next wave of Business Central? Business Central, our Business Central service that we're running in the cloud, we see that as a world-class service. It's scalable, supportable, reliable, and secure, and it needs to stay like that. If any of those parameters goes away, if it's not secure, if it's not reliable, then it doesn't matter what we put into the next release. This is what people expect. This is what people need to be able to count on. So whatever we need to continuously do to make our service stay a world-class service goes into the next wave, and we continually have that. As we have there's some must-haves like regulatory features and whatever, that also we have to follow regulations. There's also a bucket of stuff that we were maybe working on that didn't really make it until 424, that doesn't automatically get approved for 25, but we will relook at that and say, is it still important, or has time shifted so fast that it really doesn't matter anymore? After that, strategic initiatives. Right now, AI, Copilot, all of these things is we need to stay in front of the competitors when it comes to AI initiatives and Copilot. We need to ship the features that our customers expect and want to use. Scaling our partners, you guys, making sure that you are as productive as possible, not spending time on stupid things that you could avoid. Is an important one. And then, last but not least, partner suggestions. Ideas coming in through AKMS, BC Ideas, or GitHub Issues. Now, this one is really the one where we could get contributions as well, right? Because now we have ideas, and we need to figure out, can we fit this in the plan? And all of this that comes out, of course, becomes epic slices, work items, and all of that, and becomes part of our plan, where we then start working on that actually already a month before we ship the prior version. Our main branch now becomes 25, and then we start working on all of these features. Looking at our sprints, we'll like do dev and test, and then backport some of the functionality to 24.1 and ship that. That could be bug fixes, that could be small features. And we're going to do this a number of times, so we run out of numbers, and we'll be shipping 25.0. What goes into dev and test? What is that? That is spiking, grooming, development, code review, testing, documentation, partner validation, bug fixing. A lot of stuff goes into the bucket that here just says dev and test. And if we talk about open sourcing, co-development, community contributions, what can we actually help each other with here? And I think everything. Like, we can co-develop entire features, like starting at BC ideas, or small bug fixes starting on GitHub issues, or actually, if we have open sourced everything, you could even imagine that people who have an area of expertise or interest would comment on code reviews and help us make sure that the fixes we do actually are the best fixes in that area. Like, you could follow work in progress in these areas, and you can participate in code review in that. So Alexander, you have a small demo here, I think?
Yes, so another advantage of going open source is also we get a whole other way of also showing what goes into every release. So you switch the slides, perfect. So 3 days ago, for example, when we shipped 24.2, we create this release on GitHub, and I mean, you've been able to see the release notes before, but here you get another view of the release notes, and you can even click in to see the different pull requests, like what went into this change. And you can read all about like what went into the 24.2 release. If you want to dig even deeper, you can go see the full change log of what went in, what we've changed between 24.1 and 24.2. So being on GitHub just gives us like yet another option to be transparent with the whole community and show, you know, what goes into every minor and what goes into every major. So these are obviously things that we've already shipped, but we also give you the capability of seeing what we're building now. Of course, you can go under pull request and look there. But if you go under milestones, for example, you can see for 24.3, which should ship basically a month from now, you can see we're already busy building the next things for 24.3. So if these things emerge, then it seems like we're going to get some multi-file upload and so on. So these are some of the things we're working on now for the next release. And you know, if you know something about this area, please, you know, have a look at the code and leave a review if you want. So being on GitHub and being an open source just gives us like a whole new set of opportunities to be transparent with the Business Central community in the BC Apps repo.
Okay, so what's next in terms of open sourcing the Business Central application codebase? So before we look into that, just briefly, we already today have quite a lot of contributions from you guys, from the community. In our public repositories, so BC Apps went live like 8 months ago or something. We already have 67 contributions from you guys. And for AL app extensions, which have been out there for a little bit longer, we have almost 300 pull requests completed through the help from the community. In the private repository, Business Central Apps, which is where we have a copy of this base application, which Alexander talked about before, in a small pilot, limited amount of users, we still have over 200 pull requests completed by the community and helping out. Obviously, we want more of that. So where we want to go is, like, first of all, where do we want to end up with this thing? So the end goal for us within the team is to have the entire business application, the entire Business Central application part, co-developed with the community, with you guys over at GitHub. So how do we get there? Well, first of all, we need to take this private pilot that we have at the moment, and we need to kind of kill that one and go true open source story similar to what we did with BC Apps. We need to get the code out there, you need to be able to contribute, et cetera, and we need to be able to deal with all of the different changes coming in from you guys. Because not only fixing all of the technical issues that we talked about previously and the scale of things and all these things, how do we run all these test cases and the technical side of things, right? But also, how do we deal with things that we have internally with localizations today in the base application? We don't really know how to fix these things yet, so there's a little bit of work we have on our side of things. And even after we've fixed all these technicalities, we also have issues with process-related things. So there are technicalities with the scale of things, localizations and instabilities and so forth. But even if we get those things fixed, how do we deal with the challenge around like the amount of contributions we're going to get from the community and making sure that we don't end up being a bottleneck for reviewing code and getting things through the system? So, and as part of that, how do we make sure that the PM groups we had, the PMs we have, the group managers we have can keep track of all of the incoming ideas and flows and changes from you guys and steer the product in the right direction and deal with all of these ideas. And hopefully we'll be back next year with a little bit of answers to these questions. So we're going to talk a little bit about the future for ALGO.
Yeah. So we just heard about where we want to go with open sourcing the business application. And as Alexander showed you, we're open sourcing the business application on ALGO. And I think it's clear to everyone that ALGO is I think it's fair to say that many people might think that it's a Freddy project. It is actually a Microsoft project, and it's owned by the team that is standing here together with the other 5 people that are sitting at home, making sure that all the other things you saw here is still running. So ALGO is actually under the same restrictions as everything else here. We need 2 code reviewers for every single pull request, and we need to make sure that we have everything in place. We are not totally there yet with all the project management pieces and stuff like that. We're gonna get there, and that's part of what's next for ALGO for GitHub. First of all, we need to finish what we started. Right now, we just shipped a few days ago the Power Platform support that has been underway for quite some time. But in version 5.2 of ALGO for GitHub, we have that. As Alexander told you, we don't use that in BC apps, but it's something that partners could use to make sure that if they have Power Platform solutions, like integrating 2 Business Central apps, then it actually works like deployment can deploy both things. It will deploy the Business Central application first to an environment, change the URLs in the Power Platform solution, and then deploy that so you get a working environments in both areas. In the next version, we're working on the BCPT test report. We have been able to run BCPT tests for quite some while. The only output was a file with the results that you had to look into and figure out, are these numbers better than they were last time? Now with the BCPT test report, you can actually check in a baseline, and then we will test the results of the BCPT against that baseline, and you can set up allowed thresholds and stuff like that to make sure that you want to break the build if the number of SQL statements executed by your test exceeds the prior version or 10% over the prior version or whatever. We'll add support for federated credentials and managed identities. How many knows what federated credentials is? Very few. I learned it last week. And I learned it because if you think about, in the old days, we had username and password, right? If those were stolen, then anybody could do everything you could do. Now, we've done a lot of security stuff after that. And today, most people use client ID, client secret for using an app registration to be able to maybe deploy apps to Business Central or do other things. And obviously, it is kind of like a user, and through that user, you could do these things. But it's still like if those get compromised, then somebody could, no matter where they are, utilize that. Federated credentials is where you set up on that app registration that only a GitHub repository with this name and in this branch can connect or can use this app registration to connect to Business Central. That means that you can go all the way down to the branch and say, I can only publish to Business Central from that branch in this repository. And then I don't need any secrets because it's just the delivery method or the deployment method in that repository that will have that ability. So removal of secrets totally when we add stuff like that, and that can be uptaken by you guys as well. We're going to update the telemetry module to give us some more information that we can use for future development as well. Work in progress, NuGet. I don't know how many saw the session yesterday, but all of the things that you saw yesterday will be something that we're working on over the summer here, so that we'll be able to publish our apps on a few NuGet feeds, and those will be directly uptaken by ALGO for GitHub. We're also working on the indirect ALGO template. I don't know if that's ever going to ship, but it's definitely something we're working on to see if we can if it's smart enough to ship. So, the NuGet support, we'll publish all our symbols for all our apps and all our symbols to 2 NuGet feeds, and we will publish all symbols for all AppSource apps to a 3rd NuGet feed. And ALGO will automatically trust these feeds. Besides that, you'll be able to trust other feeds as well. GitHub Packages is supported for internal dependency resolution. If you want to set up external dependency resolution, you'd set up trusted feeds in your ALGO repository, and that works automatically. You can set up a secret for automatic delivery to NuGet, and we were working on also delivering runtime packages to NuGet so that you can provide other partners with access to your runtime package through that. We've been working on build performance for quite some time. Right now we can build on Linux without running the tests there. It's very, very fast, but then we kind of need to figure out a way to run tests in a performant way. We're working on making artifact downloads faster, being faster to find them, and spin up containers as well. In the end, we're also looking at whether we can split build and test so that test is happening in one place, or maybe using hosted containers or something like that, so we don't have to wait for the containers to spin up. All of this is also obviously included in the search for being able to run the 10 million tests a day or whatever. What was the number? I can't remember.
30.
Oh, sorry about that. Page scripting tests, you've seen that a few times. We want to be able to record a page scripting YAML file and just take that YAML file and check it into your repository, and then we'll automatically run these page scripting tests. What we need to do there is we need to publish a NPM module and then create the functionality for that. Code coverage is also something we've been working on for quite some time, but yeah, I think we're going to make it in this release so that we'll be able to publish code coverage. And there are tools in GitHub to show that in a UI or even show that in VS Code where you are missing coverage and where you have coverage. And then there's a lot of things in GitHub that we just get for free. Like GitHub evolves like constantly, and we get all of these things for free, but there are also things that we might need to add code for, stuff like the federated credentials that I talked about, workspaces, code spaces. Some of these things are also something that we probably need to do some coding in order for that to work. We're going to improve our ALGO for GitHub release management. Our roadmap is not like totally up to date, and our issues management, our templates and all of these things, we need to work on those to make sure that we follow the same processes as we have everywhere else, and also be able to discuss ideas and co-develop ALGO for GitHub as well as the other projects. Last slide from me. ALGO will move away from BC Container Helper. So what does that mean? So it's going to happen over the next X releases. And So there are many reasons for this. BC Container Helper is really a huge pile of very cool functionality made by one person over a number of years. We can do multiple things here, right? We can allocate 5 resources in our dev team to try to make sure that a lot of more people than one guy. I mean, I saw Tina's presentation on code reviews, and he said that there was the fear of if somebody wins in the lottery, what do we do? And this is a problem, right? And what we want to do is not to allocate 5 resources to dig into Container Helper, figure out how things works, and so everybody can maintain it. But what we want to do is we want to take DevOps relevant features from Container Helper and implement those in a Microsoft shipped PowerShell module that is supported by Microsoft. Some of these things might be in GitHub Actions, but all the things that will run locally will probably be in PowerShell modules. And then over time, ALGo will start moving over using these new PowerShell modules instead of Container Helper. So over time, the evolvement of Container Helper will be less, and the other modules will start getting the functionality that we need in ALGo, and that other people can need as well. And back to my disclaimer in the beginning, where I said that people using a managed DevOps solution, and in managed DevOps solutions, I count ALOps, Alpaca, and ALGo for GitHub, might not notice this change at all, because Waldo's going to make sure that ALOps just works, even when this happens. But people who are using a self-made DevOps solution that uses Container Helper and maybe even uses some of these hacks and stuff like that is in Container Helper might see themselves with a lot of work to do, right? So this is the reason why you should really consider whether you want to stay on a self-made DevOps solution, because you have work to do if you do that.
And once this is done, we wish you good luck on winning in the lottery.
Once this is done, he's going to fire me. No, he's not. No. I'm kidding. Then I can do something new and exciting, right? That's good. That's good for everybody. So, final thoughts?
We're almost at the end. Thank you for sticking with us. A few final thoughts to leave you with before we go into the Q&A. As we said, we'll continue to invest in Azure DevOps and ALGo for GitHub. We still have many, many repositories on Azure DevOps, and I don't see us going away from Azure DevOps anytime soon. But we are investing in GitHub, and we are investing in ALGo for GitHub, and we'll continue to uptake all these new exciting features like the BC, what's it called? BC Replay Framework. That was an internal name, wasn't it?
Page scripting.
Page scripting, that was the name. So we'll continue to invest in these things and uptaking these things into ALGo. BC Apps is out there, is our first truly open source application repository. More is coming to this repository. For now, you have the system application, you have the business foundation. If you go to aka.ms/bcapps, you can take a look, you can contribute, you can give us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you want to contribute, I did a launch event session for the latest launch event. You can find it on BC YouTube, has this title here. So it'll introduce you a little bit to how you can get started with contributing to this repository and get a little bit under the hood of what's going on in the builds and so on. And with that,
we have 17 minutes for questions, I think, up here. I don't know if I can throw that long. Should we try? Ooh, sorry.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you for these insights. I have a question. In the beginning of the presentation, code spaces was mentioned.
Yep.
Yeah. You mentioned code spaces and that you were able to connect other containers to it. But is it possible to connect a Business Central container to it? Because I wasn't able to.
Yeah, so no, code spaces are running Linux containers only. Mm-hmm. So today we cannot, you cannot spin a Windows container up inside a Linux container. The only thing you can do is from within this code spaces container, you can connect to an Alpaca container, which is a cloud container, an Azure container instance, which is also a cloud container, or an online sandbox.
Okay.
The way to do that, you have to do manually right now. It's not done like automatically as part of ALGO yet, but it's one of the things that we're looking at, how we can automate that process to like just go into a repository, say we want to edit this in code spaces, and then be able to download the symbols from NuGet, compile stuff, publish to a container somewhere, and run it.
Thank you.
It's hard to throw
Friday
that
afternoon.
So, because we talk about the containers and how we can switch to a new structure of that, I wonder how you guys build your development environment. Is it locally with the BC Container Helper, or do you make a sandbox and test all your new changes in the cloud?
Yeah, so it's really a combination of things, but no, we do not run the BC Container Helper locally. So typically what they'll do is that they'll have a copy of the code base locally, and they will download the latest builds, the outputs from latest builds from the build system, and they'll do incremental builds locally in their local computer and test locally, and they can use these test jobs and send them off for validation or deployment, like a little bit what I talked about in the beginning.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Oh, there's one in the middle there.
When you are doing the releases of a new version and we start getting the messages we are temporarily postponing, what should we imagine is happening in the background?
Probably us detecting issues and not wanting to push those versions with issues onto you. Well, of course, there are still issues.
I guess that's the reason for the 3-week staged deployment, that we start out with Finland, and then if the Finnish people are not crying, then we will continue.
Yeah.
That's a joke. Other questions? Else, I think we'll call it a session and say thanks for joining us, and have a good closing session.